My son kept telling me it was time to sell our lake house. But one night I overheard him talking to strangers. Once she signs, it's all ours. That's when I realized it wasn't about concern. It was about money. The first time I saw that lake, I was 17. My husband-to-be had driven me out in his father's truck. Windows rolled down. The July air thick with pine and water. The sun was dipping low, turning the waves gold, and he said, "Someday we'll have a place here. Just wait." I laughed, thinking it was only a dream. But a few years later, we signed papers on a clapboard cottage with peeling green shutters, and a dock that groaned like an old man when you stepped on it. We called it the Lake House, though it was hardly more than 2 rooms and a loft. Still, it became the center of our lives. Summers meant fishing at dawn, his hand steadying mine as I baited the hook. Winters meant dragging in a pine tree, still dripping snow, and trimming it with strings of popcorn and paper stars the children cut out. One Christmas in particular comes to mind, 1968. The war was on, money was thin, but we bundled the kids into the station wagon and drove up anyway. The snow came heavy that year. We huddled around the Franklin stove with cocoa, the ornaments glinting in the firelight. I remember my husband slipping his arm around me and whispering, "See? This is better than anything money can buy." And it was true. That house was more than boards and nails. It was memory, laughter, the heartbeat of our family. Years passed. We patched the roof when it leaked, painted the porch 3 times over, added a rocking chair where I'd sit in the evenings, watching loons cross the water. Even after he passed, I couldn't stay away. I'd drive up with thermoses of soup and old quilts, sit on the dock and feel him beside me. So when my son said what he did, it struck me like a slap. It was late afternoon. I had just come in from sweeping the porch, my apron still dusted with pine needles. He sat at the kitchen table, phone glowing in his hand, barely looking up. "Mom," he said casually, as though asking me to pass the salt, "it's time to sell the place." I froze. Sell? The lake house? He finally glanced at me, his face cool, his tone matter-of-fact. "It's just an old shack. Falling apart. You shouldn't be driving all the way up here anymore. It's not safe." For a moment I couldn't find my voice. The stove ticked as it cooled, the only sound in the room. I took a deep breath. "That shack, as you call it, is our family home. Your father. Dad's gone." He cut in quickly, his voice sharper now. "We need to be practical. Look at this place. The wiring's ancient, the roof is sagging. You're hanging on to memories, not a house." I set my hand on the table, feeling its worn grooves. The same table where we'd played cards and rolled out pie dough. Memories are what make a house worth keeping. He sighed, pushing his phone aside. "You don't understand business. Property like this costs money to maintain. It would be smarter to let it go while it still has some value." His words sank in like stones. But beneath the concern in his tone, I heard something else. An urgency that didn't fit. He wasn't just thinking about leaky roofs. His eyes darted away when I looked at him too long. "You've been talking to someone," I said quietly. "What?" "No. Don't start imagining things. I'm only trying to help." I stood, turning to the window. Outside, the lake shimmered, calm as glass, the dock reaching out like a hand. I thought of my grandchildren running down it barefoot, squealing as they leapt into the water. An old shack, he'd called it. The words cut deeper than he knew. When I turned back, he was already gathering his things, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Just think about it, Mom. Don't make this harder than it has to be." He kissed my cheek, quick, perfunctory, and left. The screen door banged behind him. I sat down again, my hand on the table, tracing the scratches where years ago a fishing hook had gouged the wood. My husband's laughter seemed to echo faintly in the rafters. "An old shack." I whispered the words aloud, tasting the bitterness of them. Something told me this wasn't about safety or upkeep. Something in my son's voice had shifted, and I felt, for the first time, a small tremor of unease. The lake was still beautiful, the house still mine, but the air in that room had changed. And I knew this was only the beginning. It was late, the kind of still night when even the loons had gone quiet. I had fallen asleep in the armchair by the window, an Afghan over my knees, the faint crackle of the stove in the background. The house always creaked a little when it cooled, so at first I thought nothing of the sound. But then I heard it again, not wood settling, not the wind. Voices. I slipped the Afghan off and stood carefully, my joints stiff. The floorboards moaned under my weight as I crossed to the window. I pulled back the curtain just an inch, enough to see outside. There, near the fence line where the birches grew close together, stood my son. His shoulders were hunched, his hands moving sharply as he gestured toward two men I'd never seen before. Strangers. They wore dark jackets, collars turned up, like they didn't want their faces remembered. The three of them spoke in low voices, but the night was so still that bits and pieces carried to me. Shoreline access, one man said, pointing toward the water. Renovations will be easy, said the other. My son nodded. Then, lowering his voice almost to a whisper, I heard him say the words that made my knees buckle. Once she signs, it's all ours. I gripped the windowsill so hard the paint flaked beneath my nails. My son. My boy who had learned to swim in that very lake. Who once cried when we had to leave the house after summer ended. Now plodding like a thief in the night. The men leaned closer, their breath white in the cool air. One of them handed him a folder. He opened it, flipped through quickly, then tucked it under his arm. My son's laugh, short, humorless, cut through the night. Don't worry, he said. She'll sign. I pressed the curtain closed with shaking fingers, my breath loud in my ears. My heart pounded so hard I thought they might hear it outside. Slowly, I backed away from the window, careful not to knock over the lamp. I sank into the armchair, hands pressed to my chest. The Afghan crumpled at my feet. All ours. The phrase circled in my mind like a vulture. Not all hers. Not even all mine. Ours. His words weren't about family, not about keeping the home. They were about taking. About dividing. About erasing me. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the darkened stove, listening for their footsteps. Finally, the voices faded. A car engine coughed to life in the distance. Headlights swept briefly across the pines, then disappeared. Silence returned to the lake. But it wasn't the same silence I had always loved. It was heavy now, pressing against the walls of the house. I stood, went to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water, though my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped the pitcher. At the table I forced myself to sit, to breathe. I laid my palm flat against the wood, the same table where my son had once built toy boats with his father, gluing popsicle sticks together, laughing when they tipped over in the sink. That boy, that laughter, where had they gone? I thought of the folder tucked under his arm, of the way the strangers pointed at the shoreline. Plans. They already had plans. And my son, my own flesh and blood, was standing there with them as if I were nothing more than an obstacle to be cleared away. The clock ticked on the mantel. Midnight. Then 1 o'clock. I didn't go back to bed. I couldn't. Instead, I sat at the table until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the curtains. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out onto the porch. The dew sparkled on the grass. The lake shone as if nothing had happened. Birds chattered in the trees, oblivious. But I couldn't shake the image of my son's face in the moonlight, twisted in a way I had never seen before. That morning, he came by briefly, casual as ever, as though the night had never happened. He picked up the newspaper from the porch, flipped it open and said, "Coffee, Mom?" I forced myself to nod, though my throat felt dry as dust. He moved easily through the kitchen, pouring coffee into his mug, humming under his breath. But when his eyes flicked to mine, I saw something hard there, something I hadn't noticed before. Calculation. I held my mug with both hands to keep from trembling. If he noticed, he said nothing. But I knew. I knew what I had heard. And I knew that from that night on I would have to watch every step, every word, every paper put in front of me. Because this was no longer about an old shack. It was about a scheme. And I was the last piece standing in the way. The morning after that long sleepless night, I knew I needed answers. My son's words, "Once she signs, it's all ours," gnawed at me. Why such eagerness? Why the strangers? Something was being hidden. After breakfast, I put on my good shoes and drove into town. The lake shimmered in the rearview mirror as I took the familiar road to the county office. I hadn't set foot inside in years, not since my husband and I signed the original deed. The building itself was a squat brick structure, cool and dim inside. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up when I entered. "Archives?" I asked. She jerked her head toward a side hallway. The archive room smelled of dust and old paper. Rows of metal filing cabinets stretched to the back wall, their drawers labeled with neat black letters. A single overhead bulb flickered, casting shadows that seemed to lean closer as I walked. I approached the man at the desk, white hair, spectacles low on his nose. He looked up, polite but tired. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for property records," I said. "The land around Pine Shore. My family's house sits there." He nodded, shuffled a few folders, and disappeared into the rows. The sound of drawers clanging echoed in the still room. After a while, he returned with a thick binder, setting it down with a thud. "Here's everything filed in the last 10 years for that area." I pulled the binder toward me. My fingers trembled slightly as I flipped through the pages. Zoning maps, stamped approvals, survey lines drawn in neat blue ink. First, it was the usual paperwork. But then, tucked in between, I saw it. A notice stamped bold in red. Designation: Resort Development Zone. I leaned closer, reading each line carefully. The county had reclassified the entire shoreline as part of a resort expansion area. Hotels, vacation cottages, marinas, and along with it, property values had soared. I checked the date, 2 years ago. 2 years, and no one had told me. Not my son, not a neighbor, not a single soul. My breath caught in my throat as I read the figures. Land that once might have fetched a few $100,000 was now worth tens of millions. My old shack, as my son called it, sat squarely in the middle of what developers saw as prime shoreline. Suddenly, his urgency made sense. The late-night meeting. The folder he tucked under his arm. It wasn't just about selling a worn-out cottage. It was about seizing a fortune. I sat back, staring at the papers, the words blurring for a moment. Then I remembered his voice, that cold assurance. "She'll sign." "Not if I could help it." The clerk looked up from his desk. "Find what you needed?" I closed the binder slowly, my hands steady now. "Yes. More than I expected." I copied down the reference numbers, folded the scrap of paper carefully, and tucked it into my purse. Then I slid the binder back across the desk. "Thank you," I said. He nodded, not knowing he had just handed me the key to everything. Outside, the air felt different. Sharper. The sunlight glared off the hood of my car, but I hardly noticed. My mind raced. I thought of my husband's laughter echoing across the lake, of the children's voices at Christmas, of every nail and board we had hammered in place with our own hands. And then I thought of my son, standing by the fence at night, whispering like a thief. I gripped the steering wheel and sat there a long time before starting the engine. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about maintenance. This was about greed. My own son's greed. The drive back felt endless. Every curve of the road, every pine tree I passed seemed changed. The lake still shone, calm and endless, but I couldn't see its beauty. I only saw a battlefield. When I reached the house, I went straight to the desk in the corner of the living room. I pulled out the old wooden drawer where we used to keep fishing licenses and tax forms. Inside lay the original deed, yellowed with age, my husband's signature bold beside mine. I held it for a long while, running my finger over the ink. The house was ours. The land was ours. And now it was worth more than I ever dreamed. But it was also the reason my son was willing to turn against me. I folded the deed carefully, set it back in its place, and closed the drawer. That night I didn't light the stove. I sat by the window in the dark, staring out at the lake, waiting to hear if voices would return, if cars would slow at the fence line. They didn't. Only the water moved, rippling in the moonlight. But I knew better now. The papers in my purse were proof. Proof that what I had built with love had become a prize others would fight for. And my son, my own child, was leading the charge. I didn't wait long before confronting him. The discovery at the archive burned a hole in my chest, and I couldn't pretend I didn't know. 2 evenings later, he came by again, this time with a forced brightness in his voice, carrying a bag of groceries as if that might soften me. "Brought you some things, Mom," he said, setting the bag on the counter. "Figured you could use a hand." He pulled out bread, milk, a bundle of apples. It looked nice enough, but it was a performance, and I could see it in the way his eyes avoided mine. I folded my arms and leaned against the table. "Tell me," I said, keeping my voice calm, "did you know the land here has been rezoned as part of a resort area?" The words hit him like a stone. His hand stilled on the groceries. He blinked once, then forced a laugh. "Resort area? No, Mom. You must be mistaken." "I read the documents myself," I said. "Filed at the county. This land is worth more than you're letting on." For a moment his jaw tightened. Then he slipped back into his smooth tone, shaking his head. "You shouldn't bother yourself with that kind of paperwork. It's complicated. All you need to know is the house isn't safe anymore. It makes sense to sell before it collapses." He pushed an apple across the counter toward me, as if to distract me. I didn't touch it. "Don't treat me like a fool," I said. His smile faded. The mask slipped and I saw the hardness underneath. "You don't understand business, Mom. You're holding on to memories, but this is real money. A sale is the only smart choice." I stepped closer. "So that's what this is? Money?" He set his hands flat on the counter and leaned forward, his voice dropping low. "Listen. You've had your time with this place. Dad's gone. The kids barely come up here anymore. It's time to let go." His eyes met mine then, and I didn't see my son, not the boy who once sat at this very table with peanut butter smeared on his chin, laughing at his father's corny jokes. I saw someone else. A man who wanted something and would stop at nothing to get it. "I'm not signing anything," I said firmly. His mouth pressed into a thin line. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You'll change your mind." I shook my head. "No, I won't." He gathered the groceries quickly, shoving apples back into the bag, his movements sharp and impatient. "You think you're protecting something, but all you're doing is making things harder. For me. For everyone." I straightened my shoulders. "This house isn't just wood and shingles. It's our family's heart. And I won't hand it over to strangers." He slung the bag over his arm, his voice colder now. "You'll regret this, Mom." The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the quiet house. I sank into the chair at the table, my hands trembling just enough to make the wood grain blur. He had tried to play 2 parts, the dutiful son bringing groceries, smiling, and the businessman pressing for my signature. But the second mask was slipping, and what lay beneath frightened me more than I wanted to admit. That night I walked the rooms of the house slowly, my fingers trailing the walls. I could still hear the echoes of our lives here. The children's laughter bouncing down the hallway, the sound of my husband's boots by the door. This wasn't just land. It was everything we built together. but to my son it was a number on a ledger. I sat by the window again, watching the moonlight stretch across the lake. I thought of the strangers by the fence, of the folder in his hand. A double game, that's what he was playing. One face for me, another for them. I pulled the deed from its drawer and laid it flat on the table. My husband's bold signature looked back at me. Mine beside it, steady and sure. I pressed my hand over the paper, feeling the weight of it. No, I wouldn't be tricked. I wouldn't be cornered. The house creaked in the cool night air, and I whispered into the silence, "You'll have to fight me for it." It wasn't long before I realized my son wasn't acting alone. His persistence had a pattern to it, a kind of polish I knew didn't come from him alone. It began with his wife. She came by one afternoon all smiles, holding a casserole dish as if she were doing me some great kindness. "Thought you might not want to cook," she said, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite her. She set the dish on the counter, then pulled a folder from her handbag. "This will make things easier," she said briskly. I stared at the folder. "What is it?" "Just some paperwork. Nothing serious. It's a gift agreement. You'd be signing the property over to Greg, but of course you'd still be welcome here anytime. Think of it as simplifying things." I felt my stomach turn. Simplifying for who? She gave a little laugh, too light, too rehearsed. "For everyone, of course. You don't need the burden of upkeep, and Greg can handle the details. It's just practical." I pushed the folder back toward her. "No." Her smile faltered. She tried again, softer this time. "We only want what's best for you." "I'll decide what's best for me," I said. Her eyes hardened, though her mouth still wore a polite smile. She tucked the folder back into her bag and patted my arm. "Just think about it, okay?" When she left, the casserole sat untouched on the counter. I threw it out that evening. But it didn't stop there. A week later, my brother-in-law called. A man who had never cared much for the lake, always grumbling about mosquitoes when we invited him years ago. His tone was oddly warm now. "Sis," he said, "Greg tells me you're thinking about selling the place. That's smart. No sense clinging to an old shack when the money could do more good elsewhere." My hand tightened around the phone. "I'm not selling." A pause. Then colder. "Don't be stubborn. Think of the family." That word family struck deep. Family was supposed to mean loyalty, love, not this quiet push to strip me of what I held dear. Soon it seemed every call I received carried some version of the same message. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years reached out suddenly, offering advice. "It's time to move on. You can't keep a property like that forever." Their words sounded practiced, like lines handed to them. And then came the notary. I was sitting on the porch one morning when a black car pulled up. A young man in a suit stepped out, a leather briefcase in hand. He walked up the steps with a rehearsed smile. "Mrs. Harper? I'm here on behalf of your son to finalize some documents." My heart thudded. "What documents?" "Transfer of property," he said smoothly. "It'll just take a moment. Your son assured me you were expecting me." I rose slowly, bracing myself on the porch railing. "I wasn't. And you can leave." He looked surprised, but only for a moment. Then his smile tightened. "I understand these things can feel overwhelming, but it's all been arranged. Just a signature here and everything is settled." He opened his case and slid a pen toward me. Pushed it back. "Get off my porch." His mouth twitched as if he weren't used to being told no. "Ma'am." "Off," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Now." Something in my tone must have reached him, because he snapped the briefcase shut and stepped back. "We'll be in touch," he said, and returned to his car. I stood there until the sound of the engine faded down the road. My hands were trembling, but my resolve had never been clearer. That night, I sat at the table with the deed again, tracing my husband's signature. It was no longer just my son pressing me. His wife, his uncle, distant relatives, they were all circling, pushing, ready to sign me out of my own life. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought I could bear. These were people who had eaten at this table, laughed under this roof, celebrated Christmases and birthdays here. Now they wanted to erase me, to take everything my husband and I had built. But as I sat in the quiet of that old house, I knew one thing. They had underestimated me. They thought I was weak, a frail old woman clinging to the past. They were wrong, because the lake house wasn't just walls and shingles. It was memory, history, and it was mine. And I wasn't about to let them steal it. After the notary left my porch, I knew I couldn't keep fighting alone. My son had people behind him. His wife, relatives, men in suits I didn't recognize. If they thought I was just a tired old woman waiting to be cornered, then I needed someone who remembered me differently. Someone who knew this land and its history as well as I did. That evening I pulled out my old address book, the leather cover cracked from years of use. My fingers slid down the names until I found the one I needed. Thomas Whitaker. Tom had been our lawyer when my husband and I bought the lake house, back in the early 70s. He was fresh out of law school then, eager, with more hair than sense, but sharp as a blade. Later he helped us with small things, boundary disputes, tax filings, adding my name fully to the deed when my husband passed. We hadn't spoken in years, but I trusted him. I called. To my surprise, he picked up on the second ring. Tom? It's Margaret Harper. I don't know if you remember me. Margaret. Of course I remember. The lake house. How are you? I swallowed hard. I need your help. It's about the property. My son, he's trying to make me sign it away. There was a pause on the line, then his voice dropped low. Tell me everything. So I did. I told him about the men by the fence, the folder, the notary on my porch. I told him about the archive discovery, the resort zoning, the millions at stake. When I finished, he let out a long breath. You're right. If you sign anything without knowing the terms, you could lose everything. And if your son's involved with developers, they'll stop at nothing. A chill ran through me, though I already knew it. What do I do? First, he said firmly, don't sign a single paper they put in front of you. Not one. Second, we need copies of the zoning documents and proof that you're the sole legal owner. If you have the original deed, guard it like gold. Third, be ready. They may try to push you into court, and we'll need to show you're not only competent, but aware of every move they're making. I still have the deed, I said. Signed by my husband and me. Good, he replied. That's your shield. The next day, Tom drove up to the lake house. He was older now, white hair, a slight stoop, but his handshake was strong. He set his leather briefcase on my table and spread out his papers. This is a battle, he said plainly. And battles need strategy. We spent the afternoon going over everything. I pulled the folded scrap from my purse with the archive reference numbers. He nodded, already making notes. We'll get certified copies. If your son tries anything, these will prove the land's value and classification. Developers can't touch it without your consent. I leaned forward. Tom, he'll try. He won't stop. I know, he said quietly, which is why we won't sit still. We'll prepare a counterplan. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of steadiness return. That evening after Tom left, I sat on the porch watching the sunset streak the lake in pink and orange. The pines whispered in the breeze, and for a moment I let myself remember all the summers gone by. My husband's laughter, the children chasing fireflies, the sound of the dock groaning under too many eager feet. Then the memory of my son's voice returned. Once she signs, it's all ours. I clenched my hands together. Not yet. Not ever. The following days Tom called often. He had a way of explaining things clearly without fuss. Your son's counting on you being tired, overwhelmed. But if we stay ahead, we'll force them into the open. No shady signatures, no surprise visits. Everything will have to pass through proper channels. I began keeping a notebook by the phone, jotting down every call, every strange visit, every word my son or his wife said. Evidence, Tom told me. They may claim you're confused, but a written record proves you're anything but. It was strange turning my life into notes and records, but it gave me strength. Each line I wrote felt like another stone in a wall. I was building around myself, around the house. One night just before bed, I flipped through the notebook. My handwriting was shaky but clear. April 5th. Son came with groceries. Asked again about selling. Pressured me to sign. April 12th. Wife brought folder. Called it gift agreement. Page after page of truth, written in my own hand. I closed the notebook and pressed it to my chest. I wasn't alone anymore. Tom had said something before he left that stayed with me. They think you're weak, Margaret, but you've got more grit than all of them combined. Just don't fight this battle by yourself. For the first time in a long time, I believed him. I had hidden allies now, and I was ready. It was a bright afternoon when I drove back to the lake house, though the air felt heavier than the weather could explain. Tom had warned me. Don't be surprised if they move faster now. Developers don't waste time. His words echoed in my mind as I turned into the gravel drive, the tires crunching loud in the silence. From the moment I stepped out of the car, I heard them. Voices carried through the open windows of the house, brisk and businesslike. Not the easy chatter of family, but the clipped tone of men discussing numbers. I crept closer, my heart pounding, and through the wide porch door I saw them. My son stood in the living room, not alone but flanked by two men in suits and a woman holding a leather portfolio. They had spread papers across my table, the same one where I once rolled pie crust with my children, and were pointing at maps of the shoreline. This whole section, one of the men was saying, tapping the map, is prime for luxury cottages. If we level the old structure here, we can fit at least 8 units with dock access. My son nodded, leaning in, his hand tracing the property line as though it belonged to him already. Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking. The word struck me like a blow. What I was thinking. Not a mention of me. Not a pause to consider that I still owned every inch of the land under their greedy fingers. The woman flipped another page in her portfolio. We can move forward as soon as the signature's in place. Once she signs, it's green lights all the way. They chuckled, confident. One man poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot I had brewed that morning, as though the house were already theirs. I stepped forward then into the doorway. My shadow stretched across the floor, and the sound of my shoes on the porch boards made them all turn at once. The room went silent. My son's face drained of color. The men straightened quickly, sliding papers back into neat piles. The woman shut her portfolio with a snap. "Mom," my son said, his voice high, nervous. "I didn't expect you." Clearly. I cut in, my tone sharper than I'd planned. "What exactly is going on here?" He stammered, searching for a smile. Just some preliminary talks. Nothing serious." I walked into the room, my eyes on the papers spread across the table. Sketches of cottages, plans for docks, numbers scrawled in the margins. It was all laid out. A future where my house, my family's memories were bulldozed into the ground. "Looks serious to me," I said. One of the men stepped forward, smoothing his tie. "Mrs. Harper, we're just here to discuss potential opportunities. Your son's been very helpful in outlining what's possible. Of course, none of this moves forward without your approval." The other man gave a thin smile. "Naturally, you'd be generously compensated. These cottages will be high-end, and the value of the land." "I know the value of the land," I snapped. They exchanged quick glances. My son shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting from me to the door, like a child caught red-handed. I took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch. Then I moved closer to the table, pressing my palm flat against the old wood. This house has stood here for 50 years. Every board, every nail, every memory belongs to me and the family I built it with. Not one of you has the right to plan its destruction. The woman opened her mouth, but I cut her off with a glance sharp enough to stop her cold. My son tried again, his tone pleading now. Mom, you don't understand. This is bigger than us. We're talking about millions. You don't need to live in some old shack when. I turned to him then, really looking at him. The boy I'd raised was gone, replaced by a man whose eyes gleamed at the thought of money. My voice came out steady, low. You already sold me out, Greg. Before I ever had a chance to say yes or no. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no words came. The suits gathered their papers quickly, sensing the tide had shifted. One of them muttered something about revisiting later, as they shuffled toward the door. My son didn't move, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. When the door finally shut behind them, the silence that followed was thicker than any storm. I stood at the table, my hand still pressed against it, and let the words settle in the air. This is mine, not theirs. My son looked at me then, his expression hardening. You think you've stopped this? You haven't. One way or another, this deal is going through. I met his stare without blinking. Not while I'm alive. The lake outside shimmered in the fading light, calm and endless, but inside the house war had begun. After the meeting at the lake house, I knew I couldn't wait for the next move. They'd circle back, maybe with more papers, maybe with another notary on my porch. Tom's words came back to me. Battles need strategy. So I prepared mine. 2 days later, Tom and I met in his office. He had laid out copies of everything from the county archive, stamped, sealed, undeniable. He handed me a folder thick with papers. This, he said, tapping the cover, is your shield. Resort zoning changes everything. They can't sell, build, or transfer without your explicit consent. You're the keystone, Margaret. Without you, the deal collapses. I nodded, my hand steady on the folder. Then it's time I show them. We didn't have to wait long. My son called that evening, his voice clipped. We need to talk. Tomorrow. At the house. So I went. When I arrived, the living room was crowded again. My son stood by the window, arms crossed, while his wife hovered near the kitchen with that too sweet smile that never reached her eyes. The 2 men in suits were back, along with the woman carrying her portfolio. The table was set up like a boardroom now. Neat stacks of papers, pens aligned, coffee cups waiting. Mom, my son began, forcing a calm tone. I want you to hear them out. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We can all benefit. I walked in without a word and set Tom's folder down on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood was sharp, final. What's this? One of the men asked. Documents, I said evenly. Certified from the county archive. Proof that this land is classified as part of a resort development zone. Which means no transaction can go forward without my signature. Not yours, not theirs. Mine. The woman with the portfolio frowned, flipping quickly through the top pages. Her expression changed as she read, the calm confidence slipping into unease. One of the men cleared his throat. Well, that complicates things. I looked at my son. His face had gone pale, his lips pressed tight. You knew, I said quietly. You knew this land was worth millions. That's why you've been pushing so hard. He tried to recover, his voice sharp now. It's not like that. I was trying to do what's best for everyone. No, I said firmly. You were trying to do what's best for yourself. The room fell silent. Even his wife shifted uncomfortably, her smile faltering. I leaned forward, my hands on the table. This house has stood here for half a century. My husband and I built our family here. Every holiday, every summer, every memory lives in these walls. You call it an old shack, but to me it's the heart of our lives. And I won't sign it away. The men shuffled their papers, clearly eager to leave. One muttered something about needing to reassess as they gathered their things. The woman closed her portfolio with a snap, avoiding my eyes. Within minutes they were out the door, their car tires crunching on the gravel as they drove off. When the house was quiet again, I turned to my son. His face was tight, his eyes full of something darker than disappointment. "You think this is over?" he said, his voice low. "I know it's not," I answered. "But you'll get nothing without me. Remember that." He stared at me for a long moment, then stormed out, his wife trailing behind him. The screen door slammed so hard the windows rattled. I sank into the armchair by the window, my hands trembling now that the moment had passed. The lake shimmered in the fading light, but I couldn't feel its calm. I knew my son. He wouldn't stop here. He'd already tried charm, pressure, even deception. His next move would be harder, crueler. Still, for the first time in weeks, I felt a small surge of strength. I wasn't helpless. I had proof. I had allies. And most of all, I had the truth. I looked at the folder on the table, the papers spread out like armor. This was my counterstrike. But in my heart, I knew the battle was only beginning. The counterstrike bought me time, but not peace. My son didn't return my calls for a week, and when he finally did, it wasn't to talk, it was to threaten. It began with a letter. Heavy cream paper, my name typed neatly across the front. When I opened it, my breath caught. Inside were legal documents filed with the county court. The words leapt out at me like fire: petition for guardianship. He was claiming I was mentally unfit. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands trembling as I read. According to his petition, I was confused, forgetful, unable to manage financial affairs. He had listed incidents: misplaced keys, confusion over dates, even my supposed paranoia about strangers at the fence. My own son had turned my vigilance into ammunition against me. When Tom arrived that afternoon, I slid the papers across the table. He read them in silence, his jaw tightening. "This is ugly," he said finally. "He's trying to strip you of your legal rights. If a judge grants this, you won't just lose control of the property, you'll lose control of everything. Your finances, your decisions. They'll treat you like a child." I pressed my hands together to stop them shaking. "He's trying to erase me." Tom looked at me with steady eyes. "Then we'll fight. But you have to be ready. They'll put you under a microscope. Every word, every action will be twisted. Can you handle that?" I nodded. "I've handled worse." The first hearing was set 2 weeks later. My son arrived with his wife at his side, their lawyer polished and smug. When I walked into the courthouse with Tom, I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to stumble, to falter, to confirm the story they were spinning. The judge asked me simple questions first. My name, my address, my age. I answered clearly, my voice steady. Then came the harder part. "Mrs. Harper," the lawyer said smoothly, "isn't it true that you sometimes forget important details? Dates, names?" "No," I said firmly. He slid a paper forward. "Do you recall missing a doctor's appointment last month?" "I rescheduled it," I said, "because I had a meeting with my lawyer." A ripple of laughter ran through the courtroom. Even the judge's mouth twitched. The lawyer's smile faltered. But my son leaned forward, his eyes fixed on me. "Mom," he said, his voice loud enough for the room to hear. "This isn't about property. We're worried about you. You're not thinking clearly anymore." The words cut deeper than any blade. For a moment my throat tightened and I couldn't speak. But then I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the calculation behind his concern. It wasn't worry. It was ambition. "I am thinking clearly," I said, my voice steady again. "More clearly than you'd like." The judge banged his gavel lightly. We'll hear more evidence before ruling. Outside the courthouse, the air was hot and heavy. Tom put a hand on my shoulder. You did well. But this won't be the last of it. He's determined. Determined. That was one word for it. To me it felt like war. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. Phone calls from relatives urging me to be reasonable. Letters slipped under my door with warnings about what's best for the family. Once I even found my garbage can tipped over, papers scattered across the yard. Small things meant to unsettle me, to make me doubt myself. But I kept my notebook. Every call, every threat, every incident went into it. A written shield. Tom told me, "This will save you, Margaret. They want to paint you as confused. Show them you are anything but." At night I sat by the lake, staring at the reflection of the moon on the water. This place had been the heart of my family. Now it was the battlefield of betrayal. My son no longer visited except with his lawyer. He didn't ask about my health, didn't bring groceries or news of the grandchildren. He only spoke of documents, deadlines, signatures. The boy who once chased fireflies by this very shore was gone. In his place stood a man willing to drag his own mother into court to get what he wanted. It was war. Not just for the house but for my dignity. And I would not surrender. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and dust, the kind that clings to every bench and railing. Light filtered in through tall windows, falling in pale stripes across the floor. I sat at the front, my hands folded tightly in my lap, waiting for my name to be called. My son was across the room, polished in a dark suit. His wife beside him in a sharp dress that looked better suited for a cocktail party than a courtroom. Their lawyer leaned close, whispering with the air of someone already convinced of victory. Tom sat beside me, his briefcase on the table, his hand resting steady near mine. "This is it, Margaret," he murmured. "Speak from the heart. Tell the truth. That's stronger than any trick they can pull." The bailiff called the case and the judge entered. Everyone rose, then sat again. My son's lawyer stood first, painting a picture of a frail old woman lost in confusion, unable to manage her affairs. He spoke of incidents, of forgetfulness, of erratic behavior. Each word felt like a knife twisted into me. Then came my turn. The clerk swore me in, and I walked slowly to the witness stand. My knees ached, but I held my head high. The Bible felt heavy in my hand, but I spoke the oath clearly. "Mrs. Harper," the judge began gently, "you may speak." I took a breath and looked out at the courtroom. My son avoided my eyes. His wife smirked faintly, as if she already saw me defeated. "This house," I began, my voice steady, "is not just land. It is not just boards nailed together. It is the heart of my family. My husband and I bought it 50 years ago. We built our lives there. We raised children there. We celebrated Christmases and birthdays. We fished from the dock. We laughed until the rafters shook. That house is our story." I paused, letting the silence settle. Then I reached into the folder Tom had placed before me. "These are the documents from the county archive. They show the land has been reclassified as part of a resort development zone. The value has risen into the tens of millions. And yet my son told me it was just an old shack. He wanted me to sign it away without knowing the truth." Gasps rippled through the room. Even the judge leaned forward. I laid the deed flat on the stand. "Here is the original deed, signed by me and my late husband. My name is on it. Mine. No one else's. This land belongs to me until I say otherwise." I looked directly at my son then. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "And I will not say otherwise." The lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand. "Let her continue." I drew in a breath, my voice tightening with emotion. "They claim I am unfit, that I am confused, forgetful, unable to manage my affairs. But every phone call, every attempt to pressure me, every visit from strangers in suits, I have written down. I brought this notebook today. I held it up, its pages worn from my hands. Every word is dated, every detail noted. That is not confusion. That is clarity. The judge nodded slowly. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. I finished quietly but with steel in my voice. This is not just about money. This is about dignity. About family. About a mother who gave her life to raising a son, only to have him try to strip away everything she built. I will not be erased. Not from my home and not from my own story. When I sat down again, Tom gave my hand a quick squeeze. Perfect, he whispered. The judge spoke after a long silence. The evidence is clear. Mrs. Harper is competent and capable of managing her affairs. The petition is denied. He banged the gavel once, sharp and final. My son's lawyer sagged in his chair. My son looked stunned, his face drawn and colorless. His wife leaned close, whispering furiously, but he didn't answer. I felt something inside me loosen. Not joy, not quite relief, but a deep, steady strength. I had stood my ground. I had won. Afterward, as the courtroom emptied, I lingered by the window, watching the light fall across the benches. My son passed me without a word, his eyes avoiding mine. His wife's heels clicked angrily on the floor. They were already plotting their next move perhaps, but it no longer mattered. The house was safe. When Tom and I stepped outside, the sky was wide and blue. The courthouse steps felt steep beneath my feet, but I descended them with my shoulders square. Margaret, Tom said quietly, you didn't just win property today. You reclaimed yourself. I nodded, my throat tight. Yes, but some wounds won't heal. That night, back at the lake house, I lit the stove and sat by the window. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, just as it had for decades. It was still mine, the dock, the porch, the pine-scented air. But as I traced my fingers over the grain of the table, I knew the scars of betrayal would always remain. My son had tried to erase me. He had failed. Yet the trust between us was broken forever. I whispered into the quiet room, to the memory of my husband, to the house itself. We kept it. We kept it safe. And though my heart ached, it also steadied. Because the last word was mine. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.